Welcome to this special edition of the Value Through Vulnerability podcast. We're talking about courage today, and I'm really grateful to welcome Matthew Green onto the podcast, who is an author and a journalist. Hello there, Matthew.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Not at all. Thank you so much for joining me today. As we get going, would you mind taking a couple of minutes, Matthew, just to let anyone that maybe doesn't know you get to know you a little bit better? What's your background and maybe what are you passionate about?
Well, I'm a journalist. I spent most of my career working overseas as a correspondent. I was in Africa for a number of years. Then I worked in Afghanistan and Pakistan. I was embedded with US Marines during the invasion of Iraq. And I went back to Baghdad the following year. So I spent a kind of 14-year period really running around in conflict zones a lot of the time, or certainly overseas assignments. But then I moved back to the UK five years or so ago to write a book about soldiers seeking new ways to recover from post-traumatic stress. And in a way, that was what opened me up or deepened my inner journey, because I think I'm now equally fascinated by what happens inside of us as I am by what happens out there. Obviously, the two are very closely entwined. But with so much suffering taking place on the planet at the moment, I feel that the more attention we can pay to these inner realms, the more likely we are to find solutions for what appears to be going on in the external world.
Oh, it was wonderful. I believe the book, was it Aftershock is the name
That's
of your
right.
book, isn't it, Matthew? So how's that gone down out of interest since the release?
Well, it's been an amazing journey for me personally. I spent 2 years traveling all over Britain, meeting veterans from conflicts from the Falklands and Northern Ireland right up to Iraq and Afghanistan, and their families as well, who are obviously the kind of real conscripts in the British military who get taken along for the journey. It was a real opportunity for me to deepen my own understanding of the way we approach mental health, the limitations of that dominant paradigm, and tap into some really exciting new work that really is a new paradigm, which I think is very promising. But certainly the book has made an impact. It's on the reading list now at Sandhurst, the Officers' College. I was invited to speak to Parliament a few months ago, to the House of Commons Defence Select Committee, on the topic of how we can improve care for veterans and their families. And I feel like I've built a community around some of the ideas in the book. And hopefully that's had a ripple effect and given some people some more insight and some more tools to work with. So in a way, I straddle the boundary between journalist and advocate on this topic, which is an interesting frontier to walk.
Wonderful. Just out of interest, if we just go back maybe a step into those 14 years you were going around the Middle East and Africa as a foreign correspondent, what was it that drove you to? Has journalism always been in your blood? Does it come from? Is it something you always wanted to be? Can you maybe explore? Give us a little bit more background as to how you ended up overseas for so long.
There's no simple answer to that question, and actually, the reason that we do things, or the reason we pursue the goals that we pursue at different stages in life, as I'm coming to realize, can have very complex roots that we may only be aware of in retrospect. So if you want the kind of surface story, yes, as a teenager, I watched the first Gulf War on television. John Simpson, BBC correspondent in Baghdad, watching cruise missiles turning left at the traffic lights and so on. And I saw all these journalists out in the desert, and I thought, wow, that looks amazing. I thought it looked like a way to kind of have adventures for a living, which sounded like a pretty cool profession. And I was also very excited by Africa. I spent a gap year in Africa teaching English in Tanzania, and I really was committed to returning to Africa. So really it was a kind of quest for adventure. Okay. And I'm not speaking for my colleagues, I'm speaking purely for myself. I don't think I was driven by a great altruistic motive. I wasn't setting out to kind of help people and make the world a better place. I was interested in basically having adventures. And I had my share of adventures, if you like, over that time. But I also had my share of crashes, and I suffered from periods of depression. And the latest one, well, not the latest one, but certainly the latest one when I was overseas, kicked in actually when I was on assignment in Libya during the civil war in 2011. Very inconvenient. I mean, they had enough problems as it was without a depressed journalist sort of turning up to make things worse. So that there was I always also had an interest in, how can I stop being depressed, or how can I avoid these episodes? So that was always the kind of minor key, if you like, in that period of my life. But that crisis really forced it to the fore. And I began to then question more deeply what does drive us to do these things? And I could probably give a very different answer now in having done some more of that kind of inner inquiry.
Do you mind as much as you're comfortable, Matthew, do you mind exploring that? So what is some of that internal inquiry that's sort of shown up for you the last few years since 2011?
Well, my starting point was depression. I've been very fortunate in that generally I'm in a pretty good place, but I've had various periods in my life where things have not been working for me. I first started in my late teens, again in my early 20s, late 20s, early to mid 30s, and actually again about a year ago, even despite all the progress I thought I'd made. But I've learned that these episodes, or these, I don't like the word episode because I remember someone saying somewhere, you never want to have anything in your life that has to be described as an episode. It doesn't sound good. But these periods, these experiences, these chapters that one goes through essentially unfold in a kind of spiral. So although it can feel like you're back at the beginning, you're actually not. You're progressing through a spiral. So it can feel very demoralizing if you feel like, oh my God, I've sunk back down to where I was, but actually you haven't. It just feels like that. So yeah, so this depression was obviously something that I couldn't ignore, because when it was really at its depths, I would be unable to function. I would have to take time off work. I'd find it very difficult to concentrate. I was very unwell. It is an illness when you're that depressed. So I was always intrigued and kind of engaged in things like mindfulness, meditation. These were always realms that really interested me. But I would say a breakthrough came after my period of depression in 2011 in Libya, when I came back and I went through this sort of standard talking therapy, antidepressant kind of model, which kind of helped a bit, but I was not well. And I went back to work in Pakistan, and I was still really not in a good place, really. I wasn't myself. I was functioning, but I wasn't well. And it was when I went on a 10-day silent meditation retreat in India that I really had a huge breakthrough, because I mean, this is a story in itself, but the first few days are extremely tough. Your mind is going crazy. It's very hard to sit still, to follow the instructions. But then I had a kind of moment where I began to get the technique, and I was able to sit very quietly. And it was towards the end of the retreat that I had this incredible experience of emotion, just almost in a volcanic sense, just suddenly erupting out of me from nowhere. This grief, this intense emotion. Tears and shaking. And I realized that I'd been carrying this kind of trauma in me. And I didn't even know what it was. I had no story attached to it. But as it kind of released out of my body, I felt 10 times better. And I felt better ever since that day, actually, despite my ups and downs. And I realized there's so much more going on in the mind-body system that the classical orthodox model of therapy just doesn't even begin to acknowledge. And if we're going to have any chance of really healing ourselves and our societies, we need to start exploring those realms as a matter of urgency, I would suggest.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Matthew. I think it resonates with me. So I had as you know, when we first met a few weeks ago, I had my own episode, as you say. Makes you sound like EastEnders, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I had my own. Let's call it. I call it affectionately a mini meltdown.
Yeah.
I was in business for 3 days, just completely lost it. So much pressure in my own head. And what was amazing, I actually had an experience myself 8 months ago around understanding how mind consciousness and thought operate as in principles. And I realized, I don't know if this resonates for you, I thought the outside world was doing that to me. I thought that the outside world was making me ill and upset and fearful and worried. And it took that retreat, again, stopping after 3 days to go, it's what I was telling myself about the situation that did that. It wasn't actually the situation.
Yeah. Well, this is a fundamental realization, and one could almost describe it as a spiritual awakening, where one starts to, instead of being so caught up in the external reality, when we take the time to stop, slow down, look within, we began to understand the mechanisms in our own mind, the way the mind judges, often in a very binary way, good, bad, yes, no, black and white. And we build whole stories about ourselves and our reality on that basis. And often these stories are completely wrong and certainly cause us a lot of suffering. And that isn't obviously to deny that there are problems in the world. I mean, there clearly are problems in the world. But we can begin to approach these problems from a completely different, much more empowered perspective when we begin to take some time to examine the dysfunction within us, rather than getting so consumed with the dysfunction outside of us that we forget the role that we're playing in creating and perpetuating it.
Do you know something? I just think, I mentioned at the introduction here, this is about courage, this particular conversation. We're going to release this alongside the Have Courage Summit. But I feel, you talking as you are, for me, is courageous, and I wonder what you think about this, Matthew. For me, I think it's courageous to give ourselves permission to stop. I think the society we operate within, we believe that to stop is a weakness. To stop means you should be filling that with something else if you've got space to think or to get present. There's almost a guilt associated if you stop and get present. Is that something that has shown up for you personally, or maybe in your sort of network at all?
Yes, I think the word courage is a very interesting one, very rich word to explore in the context of any conversation around mental health. Because, in fact, I was just talking about it with my partner earlier, who's a clinical psychologist. I've shared about my depression. I mean, I've written about it in national newspapers. I've talked about it in online videos. I'm very fortunate to be in a place where, for me, obviously when I've been in it, I'm not going to do any of those things because I'm not functioning and I'm deeply unwell. But because I've been able to find meaning, and in fact, for me, it's a kind of alchemy. It's the real work of we all face in our lives is to transmute what seems very heavy and dark and dense, this depression or whatever it is in your own life, whether it's addiction, anxiety, trauma, whatever your kind of particular variety of suffering is. The kind of awakening is to find ways to start to transmute that. That seems so impossible, to transmute that lead into gold, into sort of greater wisdom, greater insight, and you might say courage. So I've been very lucky in that process has been very real for me. It's something that I've experienced as a reality in my own life. So it doesn't feel courageous to me to talk about depression anymore. It actually feels like, why don't we talk about it all the time? Because for me, when somebody comes to me and says, I'm really depressed, I think great, because actually that is because you are, at some level, the life that you've built from your kind of egoic mind, your mental, and the life that's been sort of programmed into you by the culture and by society is not actually the right life for you. It's not working. And the depression is your soul, or whatever language you want to use. Some deeper part of yourself is knocking on the door saying, it's time to wake up and change. And it's extremely difficult in the beginning because the ego mind, the little me, is so wedded to the status quo, which is why the depression has to be such a kind of hammer to break through. But that's where that beautiful Leonard Cohen line comes from, isn't it? It's the crack that lets the light in. As soon as something happens to us that begins to crack that shell we've built, a much more genuine, real, authentic self can start to come to the fore. And then the journey becomes about more and more allowing that deeper, real me, or real, not even me is the wrong word, but the real authentic part of us to kind of take the reins of our life, which is terrifying. And the scary part is, in a way, living it and taking risks and stepping out of your comfort zone. I mean, that's another horrible cliche, but for me, it was about writing the book. I had a very secure job. I was earning pretty good money. I had the status. I had the quite a kind of shiny ego vehicle to drive around in, actually. And writing the book about the soldiers meant I had to, I resisted it at first. It was offered to me, and the publisher said, would you like to do it? And I was like, oh, do I really want to go back to the UK and sort of talk to all these depressed squaddies? I'm having a lot of fun being a glamorous correspondent in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And it was only when she came back again that it kind of clicked that actually the story of the soldiers is really the perfect vehicle for exploring the journey I'm on. I'm looking for healing, and so are they. So really the book isn't really about soldiers. It's about the human kind of quest to transform suffering into enlightenment. Enlightenment is a grand word, but to be at least more enlightened, to have more light in you, I think is a helpful way to look at it.
Yes, I mean, it's just such
to finish that thought, to do that, I had to make a sacrifice. I had to kind of walk away from my safety zone, my scaffolding, my money, and I'd moved back to my parents' house for 2 years. And, okay, the book got some nice reviews and so on, but it was a tougher road to walk than it would have been to stay, with the big flat overseas and the, tax-free salary and all of this kind of stuff. But I'm really glad I did it. I wouldn't never go back.
I've just got this image now of we're talking about courage. There's the most courageous part, moving back in with your parents.
Yeah. Well, yeah, in a funny kind of way, I think, and I would say that, again, it's very easy when people think of, a journalist overseas, must be so brave. I mean, yeah, there's times when there's physical danger involved, but it's actually pretty unusual. Mostly it's not dangerous. Mostly it's a lot of fun. But yeah, for me, the real courage is looking at your own shadow. Yeah. Where are the places that you're lying to yourself and you're kind of, where are the places that you're kind of pretending to be something you're not? And actually, for me, I mentioned that Vipassana, that 10-day meditation retreat. That depression was triggered by a breakup. And other times my depression has been triggered by totally, apparently different external triggers, but the mechanism is the same. The kind of, essentially, in my experience, depression is a running away from emotion. It's a refusal. It's much easier to be depressed and almost feel nothing than it is to confront the big feelings of grief or anger or sadness that you're trying to protect yourself from. So the courage is to face those feelings. It's much harder to face your unacknowledged feelings than it is to kind of actually to go to a war zone, I think. And sitting in that Vipassana retreat made me confront the way I was telling myself a victim story about, I've been dumped, isn't this awful? My life's ruined. It was an amazing relationship. No, sitting quietly with myself for 10 days, I could see my own role, my own lack of integrity, the things I did that were wrong, that actually destroyed the relationship. So I was forced to look in the mirror. And so much of the time we spend avoiding looking in the mirror. The courage is to sit there and do it. And whatever way that is for you, there's many different ways to do that. And that's what, in a sense, on a wider social level, we need to do. We look at the current political situation in many countries. So much of the shadow is now on the surface. It's so obvious. We can't not look at it any longer, which is why it's good that we're in political turmoil, because it shows that the pre-existing status quo wasn't really functioning. And that's so much the case in depression. As soon as we get depressed, we want to go back. We think, but everything was fine before X happened or Y happened. No, it wasn't fine. If it had been fine, X or Y wouldn't have happened. So that's the lie about the biggest lie of depression, really, that we tell ourselves when we're in it. If only this hadn't happened, I'd be fine. There's something much deeper going on that the depression is now forcing you to engage with and look at.
Do you know what's really sitting with me, actually, Matthew, as you spoke about the mirror? And of course, what is a mirror if it's not consciousness? So our level of consciousness is raising, whether it be the political system, whether it be with ourselves, looking into those emotions. I just really love that visual I've got right now as you describe holding up the mirror, because that's literally becoming more conscious, isn't it, in essence?
Yeah, or one could even take the old Ramdas quote of polishing the mirror. If you think of your consciousness as a mirror, it gets covered in smears and grime and grease, and there can be the reflection it's giving you can be completely distorted. And so the work of the inner work, and whether that for you is meditation or it's therapy or it's some sort of more spiritual pursuit, is polishing the mirror. It's becoming, it's sort of removing the conditioning, the programming, the trauma, the all of the kind of incrustation that we accumulate through the slings and arrows of life, right? And that's time consuming, it's hard work. But thank God that the culture now, I mean, we're having this conversation. This is part of the work. We're kind of acknowledging that this is something really important for us as individuals. And of course, as we do it as individuals, we do it on a societal level. Because another thing that I like about your work and having a summit and so on, and is that we've come out of this, you know, go back to the late 19th century, Sigmund Freud and the talking cure and Joseph Breuer and so on. It was all about a therapist and a patient sitting in a room talking. And it's like, you're an individual, you've got a problem, we need to fix you. And there's still very much that attitude in this profession up to now. I'm the therapist, the psychologist, I'm going to fix you. It's not that. It's a collective journey, because these are collective patterns. These are collective woundings. It's not, I'm a weak person because I've malfunctioned and I need to be kind of fixed and put back on the production line. It's a collective journey to a higher level of, or a more sort of awakened state of consciousness that we're all on. And we do that in community far more effectively than I mean, one-on-one can be great in certain situations, but doing it in community is so much richer. And I've been very fortunate in that I've found different kind of communities that have supported me at different times. And with technology now as well, you can create these communities without even meeting. So it's amazing what opportunities we have as a collective now.
No, that's wonderful. And in terms of those communities, I believe you've been working on a product for your community around journalism, I believe, around mental health. Do you mind speaking about that a little bit, Matthew?
Yeah, that's right. I've created an online course called Deep Background, which is a free resource for journalists. I mean, anyone can actually watch it, but I made it specifically with journalists in mind, because I understand the mindset of journalists. Or, you know, there's a certain archetype of the journalist, you know, which, if you were to look upon it in archetypal terms, you can think of a journalist as a truth teller, as a kind of, almost as a speaking truth to power, as a kind of very light, almost as a sort of admirable, heroic figure almost. But of course, all archetypes have their shadow. And of course, the shadow in journalism is narcissism, obsession with your own byline, or kind of how you look, winning awards, or it can be look at the tabloid press. It's actually distorting reality and serving an agenda, not serving the truth. So I didn't go into that in so much depth in the course, but that's kind of in the back of my mind as I made it, because I wanted to create something that would speak to my tribe, if you will. And it's comprised of a series of videos that I recorded. It totals about 40 minutes, right? Essentially is designed for somebody like me, who's a journalist, who was suddenly thinking, God, I can't cope. I'm depressed. I'm anxious. My life isn't working. It's a kind of, I call it a first aid kit. It's like break glass in case of emergency. Watch this. You're not on your own. You're going to get through it. But take a step back and realize you're not your job. That's the first thing most journalists and a lot of professionals need to learn. You're not your job. It's a job. It's not you. It's actually just the costume we wear. And you've got so used to the costume that it feels like it's you. But that's the kind of cosmic joke. When you see that, it's like, oh, I was so invested in this identity, but it's not me. It doesn't mean you can't, and this is the point I make in the course, go back to that identity. Be a better journalist. I think I'm a much better journalist as a result of my depression, you know. I'm much more able to empathize, listen. I think I can connect with people in their suffering far more readily than I could have done if I'm like with my notebook. So that's what the course is. You can find it online. I'm sure we can add a link or something. It's called Deep Background, which is a kind of play on words, because my deep background in journalism is a specific term. It means if you're given a background briefing on deep background, it means you can use it for your understanding, but you can't use any quotes. So it's a kind of,
Okay.
it's telegraphing to journalists that, you know, I'm one of you. But my first course was called Deep Work, and that's a longer course, which is reflecting more on depression more generally, and it's aimed more at the kind of anyone, not just journalists. So I've got those two courses, which are available, and I'm working on with my partner on a third one called Deep Connection, which will be designed for supporting. It's aimed at someone who's supporting a partner through depression. So if you're supporting someone who you're not depressed, but your partner is, it's the course for you.
That's wonderful. Where are those going to be housed? It's a good time, actually. If you, so you could maybe share your website.
So if you go to matthewgreenjournalism.com, you can see the Deep Work course. You just click on it. The Deep Background course you can find on the same platform. Oh dear, it's so complicated. There's a link to it, but go to my website, matthewgreenjournalism.com, and then you'll go into the Deep Work, and then you'll find Deep Background there. If you have a problem, just email me through the website, or, you know, it's not like I've got 10 million people watching it yet, so I can give you some individual attention if you're having trouble on anything technical.
Well, that's wonderful. Obviously, share the links with myself as well, and we'll make sure they're on the show notes of the podcast anyway. So that's
great.
Not a problem at all. So I'm just conscious of time. What in this space and the work you're doing at the moment, Matthew, who or what is inspiring you the most right now? Bit of a random question, but I'm interested.
It is a random question. I'll tell you, for me, it's the Psychedelic Society and the new frontier of psychedelic assisted therapy.
Okay.
This is something that I'd never taken a psychedelic or any real drug in my life until relatively recently. And there's a great deal of misconception and kind of prejudice around this. But when I was working with the soldiers, I saw the limits of our talk therapy and if you're a soldier with trauma, you're going to be given if you're lucky, probably a bit of talk therapy, maybe a bit of what's called EMDR, which is a slightly different type of therapy, but, which can be great. And you'll be probably given antidepressants or anti-anxiety medications, and it'll take you months, if not years, if ever, to recover. So what's exciting about psychedelic assisted therapy, and this is coming out of Imperial College London, Johns Hopkins in the US, respected institutions that are taking place in this psychedelic renaissance, is that they use substances like MDMA or psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, in a very contained, safe way. It's not like taking drugs at a party or in a festival. No, just take that out of your head. It's about doing a structured course of therapy, say like 10 sessions of preparation. What is it? What is the problem that you can't look at? What is the shadow that you can't look at? That trauma you've suffered, the abuse maybe you suffered as a child, something that's so awful you just can't go there, and it's perpetuating your addictions or your symptoms of trauma. You can't get there through talking. It's just too triggering. You're not going to get it. And like me with my Vipassana, I would never have got to talk, that release, that catharsis through talking. I just know I wouldn't. I had to. So with the psychedelic therapy, the therapist then gives you the psychedelic, and you use it as a tool to kind of open your heart and still your mind down, and then you can kind of journey into that trauma safely and do the kind of neural rewiring to kind of establish a different belief system that you just can't do through talking on its own. So it's a catalyst. One of the therapists, one of the psychedelic psychiatrists that I know who's doing some of this research says, our conventional medications are like trimming the branches on the tree. It keeps growing back. You trim the branches. You take your antidepressant every day. You take your anti-anxiety medication. It's not getting to the root of the symptom. It's just suppressing the symptom. It's masking the symptom. I'm not knocking these drugs because I know that they help a lot of people, and I think they're part of the solution. But why I'm excited about the psychedelic renaissance is it's more like creating a way to unearth the cause of the symptom. It's like an antibiotic in general medicine, but the equivalent for psychiatry. And you may only take the psilocybin once or twice, maybe 1 or 2 sessions with your therapist, and then some follow-up. But that has on the trip, you go into a sort of state of hyperconnectivity in the brain that makes it much easier, that you can really engage this neuroplasticity. You can really change some of the old thought patterns in that window of opportunity that this trip creates. And the results that are coming in, the clinical results, are incredible. And in the US, the Food and Drug Administration has just granted breakthrough therapy status to psilocybin therapy, i.e. magic mushroom therapy. And last year, or the year before, it gave breakthrough status to MDMA, i.e. ecstasy therapy for PTSD. So, this is mainstream now. This isn't some fringe kind of pursuit of hippies. This is like hardcore science, mainstream medicine, big institutions starting to recognize the healing potential of these drugs. And I was able to experience psilocybin myself in December on a retreat in the Netherlands, which was run by the Psychedelic Society of the UK, because it's legal over there. Mm-hmm. I wrote about it for the Financial Times, and I had a very healing and very well-supported, safe experience. So, obviously these drugs aren't for everybody. You've got to make sure you don't have a history of psychosis or bipolar disorder and so on. But, all medicines have their contraindications, but in the right environment, responsibly used, they can be, I think, very exciting tools to greater growth.
It's just, thank you for sharing that, Matthew. That's just such a powerful example of what's going on outside of the mainstream. Let's say, so it's coming mainstream. Yeah. We're still talking too much about popping pills, which clearly aren't working for most people. So
they aren't.
Great message.
And what I like about the site, I've stood up when I've given talks about the book, and I've said, and there's the psychedelic renaissance, and you can see people going. The reaction is sort of, oh, scary, drugs, bad, and it's like, hang on, you've been subjected to sort of, ever since the war on drugs in the early 70s, just decades of propaganda saying that these things are dangerous. But the science suggests that they're nowhere near as dangerous as you think. And secondly, that in the right environment, they can actually work way better than anything we're using at the moment. I think we're still in the Stone Age in psychiatry. And I'm not, a lot of psychiatrists will say this. They're desperate for some new approaches, new interventions, because they're just not helping people quick enough. And if you don't fit the box, they write treatment resistant on your records and send you home. Treatment resistant. Can you imagine? What if the treatment isn't adequate? So the psychiatry is a kind of in a huge impasse, and a lot of therapy is actually, a lot of therapy is, and it's not, a lot of therapists as well need to do the work on themselves. So I'm kind of, I'm like, I'm nailing, I am sort of Martin Luther style. I'm nailing this to the church door and saying, guys, you need to start thinking a bit differently, because we need a renaissance in psychiatry. And I think the psychedelic renaissance is really, really exciting.
Well, do you know something? It resonates so much with me, because I actually my full-time job is in the chemical industry. So I supply solvents that go into making some of these drugs. And do you know something? I've for quite some time now, joking apart, without being too political on this podcast, there's going to be a bit of at some point, because you're talking multi-billions, trillions per year in the pharma industry. And if they don't own it, that's going to be part of the political challenge, I think, in the next decade. But that's a different story.
Yeah, fascinating.
So as we wrap up, you spoke about the website. How else can people reach out to you, Matthew?
The best way to get me is definitely the MatthewGreenJournalism.com, and there's a contact form there. I'm always happy to chat to people. I mean, I feel like what's so exciting for me, and this is partly my own journey, sort of stepping out of I'm still working in a kind of, I'm between jobs, but I'm still engaged with the sort of corporate world of the media. It's still my home in many respects. But what I've gained from sort of spending some years stepping outside of it is that I really think that the era of hierarchies is beginning to come to a close. And we're in the era of networks now. Yeah. And technology enables this. And the idea that some of us are greater, yes, we all need to have respect for legitimate authority. But at the same time, we're our own authorities, right? We're our own, ultimately, when we get more connected, we have so much more authority than we've ever been allowed to have or been told. This is what you realize through meditation. It's what the psychedelic experience teaches you. And it's so wonderful to see this now manifesting in real time as we're talking now. We've never even met. We're connected through social media, but we're obviously having a meeting of minds, and hopefully what we're saying will have positive ripples for other people as well. So I love it when people email me through the site, and or I'm on Twitter, Matthew_Green. But yeah, email me, check out the course, deep work. And, you know, let's just all kind of like step out of our day-to-day identities and recognize each other as human beings and just work together to turn this situation around in our personal internal world, in our family, in our community, and on a planetary level. I mean, this is what we're here for. Let's do it.
Oh, well, you said it shivers up my spine, Matthew. I love it. There's a call to action, listeners or viewers. You know, wonderful. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time, Matthew. You've been an absolute joy.
Great. Thanks, Gary. Cheers.
Take care.